Well, while the choir joins us in the pews, let's thank the choir. They've been here all week, and they've done such a great job. Happy Easter. We come together to celebrate what God has done for Jesus on this day. He is risen. Love is stronger than death. Alleluia. It is good news. And there's even more good news. Phillips Brooks, the famous preacher and the Bishop of Massachusetts back in the 1890s, he said this: "Let every man and woman count themselves immortal. Let us not merely say, 'Christ is risen,' but 'I shall rise.'" And that doesn't mean just life after death. It does mean that. It also means resurrection in this life. You know, Jake Owensby is a friend of mine, and he's the Bishop of Weston, Louisiana. And he wrote a book called The Resurrection-Shaped Life. And how do we get that life? We get it by practicing the way of life, which is the way of love, that Jesus led. So let's spend the next 10 minutes looking at the way Jesus lived and how we can follow him in a resurrection-shaped life. At his baptism, Jesus heard words from God saying, "You are my beloved Son." And he heard those words before he ever did anything great or awesome. No miracles yet. And yet he's called God's beloved Son. That can also be true for us. You know, there's a theologian who wrote, "You must try to pray that in your prayer you open yourself, that sometime you are able to hear God say to you, 'I love you.' These words addressed by God to you are the most important words you will ever hear. Because before you hear them, nothing is completely right with you. But after you hear them, something will be right at a very deep level to live a resurrected shaped life." Jesus also lived a life of gratitude. Remember the story of the feeding of the 5,000? My favorite Bible story. 5,000 people are gathered in a deserted place to hear Jesus preach, to be healed, to be forgiven by him. But as evening draws near, the apostles tell Jesus to send them away. They're going to need to eat. We don't have any food. And Jesus says, "Well, there must be a Dunkin' Donuts near here somewhere." And the apostles say, "No, Jesus, we do not live in Massachusetts. This is Israel. No Dunkin' Donuts." So Jesus says to the apostles, he says, "Well, you feed them." And they say, "Jesus, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. It is not enough." And so then Jesus says, "Give that to me." And what he does is he thanks God for the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He blesses them. He gives them away. God multiplies the grace. All 5,000 are fed, and there's food left over. Could we, in our life, live a life of gratitude? Instead of looking at what we have and saying, "It is not enough," to say, "This is a gift from God." You know, one of my spiritual practices is that as I begin each day, right after I wake up, even before I get out of bed, I say in my mind and my soul to God, "Thank you for my life. Thank you for another new day." It makes a big difference for me because it feels like resurrection. Jesus also spent time in silence. He went away to pray in silence. In our busy, sometimes chaotic lives, we are invited by Jesus to intentionally put time aside to simply be in God's presence. It's part of a resurrection-shaped life. You know, Jesus spent time alone, but his life was community-centered. He called disciples. He gathered people into community. And you're choosing to do that right now by coming here. You're not spending Easter morning praying privately. You're spending Easter morning in a community of other believers, people who support you in your belief, and you support them in their belief. The spiritual life is not a solitary life. It's a life lived in community. Luke's gospel tells us that Jesus grew in wisdom and in understanding. We know that Jesus never sinned, but he grew in wisdom and understanding. He had his mind changed. There was a time when Jesus thought his mission was only to the people of Israel. And in an encounter with a mother who requested help for her dying child, Jesus recognized he was called to serve all people. As followers of Jesus, we are called to be lifelong learners. Jesus was curious. Do you know in the 4 Gospels, Jesus asked 307 questions? Count them up someday. 4 Gospels, 307 questions from Jesus. You know, we commonly say, Jesus is the answer. But maybe Jesus is the question. He's always inviting us deeper into the one precious life that we have. Of course, Jesus always heard the cry of the poor and the suffering. The stories are abundant. They are at the core of his mission of mercy, compassion, and hope. Oftentimes in those stories, we are told Jesus lifted him up, or she got up. Those words are similar to raised up, showing us again that resurrection is not just at the end of life. Resurrection happens within our lives, and we're called to be sources of resurrection in the lives of others. You know, in this time of tremendous political tension in our country, it's important to note that Jesus called out the political leaders of his time. Jesus loved all people. But when King Herod was behaving as a tyrant, Jesus called him out as a fox, that fox Herod. And in those days, that didn't mean clever. It meant weasel. In a resurrected shaped life, we are called to participate in our political process and to vote our values. Through it all, Jesus lived ever mindful of what his parents taught him. We know that in Luke's gospel, Mary would see things happen and she would treasure them in her heart. She remembered grace-filled moments in her life. Matthew's gospel tells us his father, Joseph, would hear from angels in his dreams. It happened 4 times. An angel visited Joseph in his dreams. Joseph dreamed of a better, safer world, and he acted on it 4 times. Together, Mary, the keeper of memories, and Joseph, the dreamer, raised the Prince of Peace. What are the memories that you treasure? When you look back on your life, what are the memories that you treasure, that you store in your heart, just like Mary did? And just like Joseph, what is your dream for your life, for your family, for your community, for our world? And why did Jesus tell us all this? The gospel tells us, I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. To follow Jesus in a resurrection-centered life means to be a person of joy, to know God's love. You know, there's so much more to say about Jesus. John's gospel ends with these words. There are so many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the whole world could not contain the books that would be written. The whole world could not contain the books. Well, I'm going to end this sermon knowing there's so much more to say about Jesus. He can't be summed up in one sermon. Christ is risen, alleluia. And we are invited into the joy and the purpose and the meaning of the resurrection right now and in life eternal. Amen.